All right.
Okay,
It's all
Penny.
you.
Awesome. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I want to take a moment and introduce our speakers for tonight's panel, which is titled "Create with Us, Not for Us." I think we, in case for context, Pride this month's national theme for Pride is unapologetically us. So today we are going to be talking about creating authentic product experiences and campaigns for the LGBTQIA+ and queer community. I will be using queer as an umbrella term today, just for our own purposes, but I will let all of the speakers on this stage define how they want to be referred to. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm going to start with Selena, who is currently works in the ML infrastructure space at Forethought, which aims to improve the customer service space through human-centered AI. Previously, she worked at Tinder on both the ML infrastructure and web platform teams, building user products such as the Tinder card stack, Tinder profiles, and gender and sexual orientation selection during onboarding. Welcome, Selena. Next, we have Adante Langston, who's a video creator whose passion for creating inclusive content touches everything from video editing, filming, and concepting. Adante's current aspiration as a creator is to transition into the commercial advertising industry to build social content that resonates with diverse audiences. A lover of music, fashion, dance, and gaming, Adante is a Baltimore area native and recent Stevenson University graduate, where he focused on film and moving image. Welcome, Adante. Next, we have Carrie. Carrie currently leads global branding and marketing efforts for 2 major pharmaceutical companies across their entire portfolios. Although his primary focus is medical and pharma, previously has helped develop and launch campaigns for hundreds of brands across dozens of categories, with many focused on marketing directly to the LGBTQIA+ community, promoting inclusion and modern communication. And I'm Kristen. Who am I? Why did we lure you here? Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that literally everything that is not about my reproductive rights right now feels off topic to me. But while our focus today is indeed on creating inclusive experiences and products within the queer community, and it isn't entirely off topic. In fact, members of the queer community, myself included, are reliant on reproductive health care. And the products and experience we build can help shape what our future looks like. I find myself here as your humble moderator, unapologetically queer and Black, also a woman, a former staff writer for online publications, who rarely made $1 out of 15 cents an article. As a creator, you may have seen me at the bottom of your algorithm, also trying to make 15 cents until they took away Obamacare and I sold out to have a really good time creating ad campaigns. Today, as a content strategist and designer who wants to create objective experiences for users to make well-informed decisions they can feel good about. Like the folks I've introduced for today's discussion, I and many of you may wear identities that you didn't ask for, nor were you involved in their nomenclature. Like you, I want products. I want experiences that not just trigger the layers that don't trigger the layers of oppression I experience on a daily basis. Today, we're going to talk about how to do that, how not to do that, and how we as creators can show up for our communities authentically without carrying the emotional burden that often feels like the weight of the world on our shoulders. And as we move begrudgingly, kicking and screaming and fighting towards a post-Roe world, at least for the moment, we need more now than ever to think about creating with, not for, the queer and other members of marginalized communities who are impacted by trauma at greater volume. So that was a heavy intro. Before we get to the meat of this discussion, let's talk about some of your positive experience as it relates to your relevant functions. I'm curious, what are some of the more impactful products or campaign some of our speakers have worked on? Selena, do you want to start us off and talk about some of your previous products or campaigns that you found meaningful to your own identity and self?
Sure, yeah. So I think for the purposes of this talk, I will be talking mostly about my experiences building client-facing products at Tinder. I think that's the most relevant. So one of the projects I worked on was supporting multiple sexual orientations as part of gender and sexual orientations. So essentially, if y'all have used Tinder, I think it is pretty similar across other dating apps at this point, but you can like kind of choose your sexual orientation or your gender. So before this project, you were only able to select like female or male. And then, so my project was basically allowing users to select a more specific gender that they identified with. And there was also an option, so there was like a much longer list of options for both gender and sexual orientation. And if you didn't see one in the list that fit your identity, you could add your own in. So I think that was pretty impactful because obviously, like, you know, gender and sexual orientation is not just binary, it's a pretty large spectrum. So it was really great to work on a product that allowed people to, feel more seen in their identity as they were using a dating app. And I think especially for a product such as a dating app, that is a really important part of your identity. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I would agree. I think that there are some companies and platforms that have a bigger role in creating inclusive experiences, especially when we talk about jobs and health and dating and those more personal experiences, less than the Candy Crush and other types of apps. What about you, Carrie? What are some impactful campaigns that you've worked on that might have touched your community?
I've fortunately been able to work on a few, but I think one that impacted me directly was a few years ago. I got to work on a campaign where we were trying to, it was attached to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And for Make-A-Wish, it tends to be very hetero, which I at the time didn't really realize that was an issue with them. But we were able to build a campaign that targeted a lot of families that were not becoming involved because they just felt as if they would be utilized as just like a tool or mascot. So the goal was to be able to get them to a point where they felt comfortable with it, and we built campaigns around that.
Oh, I think you're muted. Hold on one moment. Do you want to back up 1 second? I think we lost you after maybe 3 seconds ago. Not.
Okay, no worries. But we were, so something, we basically opened up our first market to try to help target more families, make it feel more inclusive of our queer community in Texas. And it actually ended up being so rewarding and so fantastic. The only drawback, which I can probably talk to it as we get later on in the discussion, that it wasn't carried over into the next year. A lot of the work that we had done was really amazing, really impactful, really heartwarming to me. It was one of those projects where you kind of just feel your baby grow and see it. And they've kept a lot of that, but they didn't keep all of it. But overall, I absolutely loved every second of that.
So sorry, had a hard time getting off mute. That sounds amazing. And what do you think? It sounds like you have some pretty positive memories from that experience, both you and Selena. So I am curious to know, what are some methods that you may have applied to stop that burnout or feeling the emotional burden that comes from representing your community while performing your critical job functions? I mean, in other words, how are you to protecting yourselves in these really vulnerable experiences while providing these really inclusive experiences?
I guess I can go first. That is a challenge that I've faced for years, including present day. It's one of those. It's easy to get burned out sometimes, just because every time something comes up, where they're like, "Hey, we want to target the LGBTQIA plus community," they're like, "Okay, go to Kerry. He's the ambassador. He knows everything about it." That part gets a little repetitive, gets a little old, because you have to often remind people, like, yes, I'm part of the community, but I don't speak for us. We're not a hive mind. But I think when I was younger, it was harder to speak out. You just kind of just smile and go with it. I think the benefit of age and maybe just experience with it, I feel more comfortable with just kind of speaking out. Like, even though this targets the gay community, I know nothing about gym shoes or whatever the case may be.
Right, absolutely. And I think that, all of us, on this panel have at least been in a few scenarios where we may have not even been correct in whatever assumption we may have about our own community. And it's certainly unhelpful and really shocking to stakeholders that we could ever be wrong about, our own folk. They're like, wait a minute, I thought you knew Black people? And it's like, oh man, I don't. So what about Selena? I'm very curious about you and how you've protected yourself on a more product side, also experiencing that sort of double jeopardy of being both queer and a person of color. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the whole experience of like working on a dating app, it's really relevant. And like, for example, I guess the project that I was just talking about with multiple genders and sexual orientations, it was interesting to work on that product as a member of the queer community, where most of the other people on my team or the other people working on the product, especially the product managers, were like not part of that community. And it's a little bit difficult. I feel like you have to end up pushing more for what is like probably better for the community, but that they might not realize because they just like don't have those experiences. So that was one thing that was interesting to me. A little bit difficult, but very eye-opening as well.
Of course, yeah. And Adante, I know you are still nearing those opportunities to, influence stakeholders' opinions and decisions that impact your community. But I'm curious to know, as somebody who's coming into this space, what are some ways that you're prepared to protect yourself in these spaces? Is there anything that you've thought about, that you've worried about, or that you're like, I have this meditation app, I've got it down. Just curious to know what you think about speaking on behalf of your community and what that emotional bandwidth is. You looking forward to it?
Yeah, I don't know. It's even not, because even just with my personal experience, like I've just came out as bisexual to my family and my friends within like the past 2 years. So when I walk into a room and I address people and people see me, they're not like, oh, Dante, a person that identifies with the queer community, because most people that see me assume that I'm a straight man. So I feel like a big part of me reaching out and talking to. Oh, was that me? Oh, okay. Sorry. I don't think that was me. A notification didn't come up. But yeah, I just feel like going forward, when I do get to the point where I am addressing the community and representing me, I feel like there are going to be a lot of people that are kind of like shocked just because of the fact that you wouldn't know my sexual orientation or how I identify necessarily unless you got to know me on that personal level. And I guess that's something where I have to decide whether it's like a good or a bad thing, kind of keeping not hidden, but just learning myself how to identify more as a queer person.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really valid.
Just add to
Um,
Dante's point.
mhm.
Dante, I absolutely agree with you. Like for most people who meet me, they have no idea that I consider myself. I mean, I say gay or bi. It really, I think I was talking to a couple of folks before where, it really just changes with my mood, whatever season I'm feeling at the time. But you really can't tell unless I let you into that world. So, um, but it still puts you into a weird situation where I've had, people will say things like, I've had a manager tell me like, like, are you sure you're gay? Because you don't really act gay. So, you deal with these kinds of things too, where, she was just the latest one, but throughout the years, I've been questioned about it, like, but you don't act it. So yeah, I fully understand what you're saying, man.
Absolutely. I think the you don't act gay is the typical reaction that a lot of people hear when and it can be really re-traumatizing when you're in a workspace and you hear that. It and it's hard to clap back at a manager, right? So sometimes we end up rolling with those punches. And speaking of the managers, Carrie, I'm really curious because since you brought it up, is there a difference in how you do speak on behalf of the community versus how you speak on behalf of your community through your work versus how you speak on behalf of the community to leadership or clients or stakeholders? Like is the message the same? Is the content the same? Is the tone the same?
That's a good question. It changes. I would say it's probably three different modes. If I'm speaking to, like like if I'm speaking within a product, like if I'm trying to build voice or tone instead of content, it varies based on who the target is and what the goal is. One of the things that kind of, lack of a better word, that kind of irks me is when companies try to speak to my community and they just get just hyper gay. And it's like, okay, you don't have to, put feathers on this, content. It's totally fine. But that's transitioning over to when I speak to clients or leadership or things like that. It's for them, it's the same way where a lot of them will feel like, okay, well, especially in this season, which we've all seen, every company gets very rainbow. And it's a matter of just trying to, when I will depending on what the content is, the content of that meeting is, I'll let some things just slide because you have to sort of pick your battles. But when it comes to like, okay, so now we're building a real tone, a real voice, then like I said, I think it's just because of my experience of how many years I've had in it. And basically my age, I tend to speak up a lot more because some stuff just sounds really cringy and it's like you can't, especially if you're trying to get real specific, if you're trying to market to the gay Black community, it just goes over the top. But then there's the third way where I'm speaking to folks that are like in my community, then yeah, it's a lot more relaxing. I speak way more openly with them. And it's a lot easier because I find a lot of folks who will feel as they're, again, since I don't project the stereotype of gay, a lot of them are really kind of standoffish at first, like they're afraid to open up until I open up more with them. And then it becomes a lot cooler, a lot more relaxed, a better community. But even then, if I work with them, it's a lot of times, you find yourself people like Black people, we know about code switching. It's the same thing. You get a code switch to like, mixed company, like white rooms, to a Black community. Like I'm speaking to them. It's the same way with the gay community or the straight community. I've got a code switch. So.
And just to be clear, when you say extra and over the top, do you mean the Black gay community, or are you including queer women in that as well? Black queer.
Absolutely, all of it.
All of it. It's all of it.
Yep.
Okay, great. And I want to be clear about that because we're going to get into audience segmentation soon. So and before we do dive into some of the more technical stuff though, I do have a couple more questions. Selena, I'd love to know if you have a difference in terms of like how you advocate for what you believe is right for community, and maybe being an important engineering decision or stakeholder decision versus how you communicate that same need to a stakeholder?
I'm trying to understand your question. Are you saying like the difference between how you approach it, like from a product perspective versus like when you're like interacting with like upper management about it, or? Yeah, so like I think it does feel like two kind of different avenues for me, because on one hand, when you're like working on it from the product side, you kind of feel a responsibility to, for me, I feel like I felt at Tinder, at least, I felt more of a responsibility to like the entire community, because, a lot of people use our app. Versus when I think when I interact more with like, when I was interacting more with upper management about it, maybe like I think of my involvement with the Pride ERG that we were part of, and that felt more like advocating for myself and the people in the community who work with me, if that makes any sense. So I think the approach was a little bit different, but still pushing for improvements in the, I guess, same overarching community.
Right. Let's shift gears. I think we're touching upon some really interesting stuff. I'm eager to get there. And I know, we know that, as you alluded to, product features are built with algorithms in place that use audience segmentation of gender on social platforms to reach the intended target audience. We also know that user research fundamentally relies on gender data to inform the user experience. And in the marketing world, we see audience segmentation and user acquisition to target users in gendered buckets. But here's another thing we found out. Research suggests that a considerable percentage of people who currently identify as non-heterosexual or cisgender have shifted in their understandings of their sexual identities over time. The research demonstrates that for queer folks, there's a complicated relationship between gender identity and transgender identity. When you consider these insights, it would appear an individual's sexual and gender identities, especially for queer people, cannot be understood as a set of static, fixed data points. So let's break down how this gets determined and why through function. Let's start with you, Selena. How do we really determine product features are being built by design with the queer community? And I'll break that down in a more granular way. I'm looking for, I think what we're all interested in is ways that product and engineering teams can partner with community organizations or internal resources to inform that technology is supportive of gender and sexual or identity on a spectrum. And I think you alluded to this a bit with the ERG that you were part of as well, and some of the products that you built. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so for I think one thing that we tried to do, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully at Tinder was, so we had our Pride ERG, and we had like we tried to have a kind of relationship between that ERG and the product org, so that like we could raise any like concerns or like improvements that we wanted with the app, so that this would go into the actual like product design and creation, because frankly not there was not a large, like most of the product org was just not in the community, and like and also likewise with the people who are building the actual product. So for example, things like trans users getting unjustly banned from the app, that was like something that we were um, thought was really important. That was something that we like tried to have a lot of conversations with the product team about. So I think that is one way you can do it like internally, if you do have a Pride ERG. But like if you don't, then that gets a lot more difficult. I think externally, something we did at Tinder, we had like, I forget what the term is for it, but like I know the product team like did like out, they would like test the app with like different groups of people outside of Tinder, to kind of like test out new features and stuff. I don't think we ever, in my memory, I don't think we ever did one that was like specific to like testing out a feature with like a group like externally, but I think that would be something that could be useful, so that you like get the immediate feedback first.
Well, Selena, we shouldn't be sharing our secrets, but we did in fact partner with GLAAD and on a couple of different features and use some of the research from there.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah.
But that's an excellent point. I think those are really great ways. I'll break that down for us, where we've got, the employee resource groups. And for y'all who don't understand what those are for essentially these safe spaces created by companies that are part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, where hopefully, depending on your employer, the leaders of these employee resource groups are getting fairly paid for their vulnerability and extra bandwidth, because they do get involved in things like marketing and product decisions and can be utilized. And for companies that don't have that, like Selena alluded to, you can also use partner with local and national organizations to help inform some of that experience. Again, working with and not for. Let's think about the creator side though. Adante, how do the features impact queer creators and entrepreneurs? Can you think of I'll also break that one down. Can you think of an implementation on a platform, whether it was social, lifestyle, dating, Airbnb, now I'm naming apps, which I should not do, or other apps that negatively impacted your ability to perform, create, or show up authentically? So think about this from either the side of a user or a creator in this experience, and how these features are implemented, and what your experience has been, either whether you're monetizing or just working on your personal work.
Sorry. Yeah, I see it a lot, especially just watching other creators, and specifically with like Instagram. Well, I guess it's not just Instagram, because Facebook owns Instagram, so it relates back to Facebook as well. But they just have a lot of algorithms. They have a lot of like keywords and words and stuff that are in their, I guess, dictionary that they look for, where they will actually like I can't think of the word right now, but they will shade your content. So like, I have seen this personally many of times, where if you put a certain word, so even for example, like with racism, if you post something on Instagram, like on your story, for example, that talks about these heavy topics, abortion rights, all of this stuff, you tend to see that those posts don't go as viral, or they don't get as much exposure as just regular content. So yeah, for specifically Facebook and Instagram, I definitely see how like the censorship and a lot of that is definitely directly affecting creators. And yeah, it's kind of tricky to think about ways to get past that.
Absolutely. And I think that you hit it right, is that, you know, it was, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was off. It's very similar in the editorial space as well. When, excuse me, when you are using search engine optimization, you can, it would happen with us at Tinder. An article would mostly be about Craigslist, but they would use Tinder in the headline because that would bring up those search engine results. Or even using more like, we all see those like attention grabbing headlines that actually are only a third of what the article's really about. So, and since we're talking about, you know, advertising, I think when we think about building these experiences and campaigns, I can think back to noticing product features at my time at Peloton that existed solely for people to filter their workout by gender, only 3 genders. And it made me wonder how gender identity would impact one's metrics and what data supported users need and desire for such a function. Moreover, it made me wonder what types of ads from Peloton I saw as a queer Black woman. So, Carrie, curious if you could talk to us a bit about audience segmentation within marketing campaigns. Specifically, what are the limitations in place by social platforms like Facebook and YouTube in terms of what you can segment? And also, if you can share, we're interested in knowing what are the goals and, you know, essentially like what are those KPIs when targeting these audiences by gender? Because as our data that we pulled earlier indicated, there's a certain type of fluidity that comes to sexual orientation and gender identity that creates these disjointed algo-driven ad experiences. Can you talk to us a little bit about the limitations and what are some of those goals?
Sure. Well, that's going to be a little tough because in my experience, I've worked on a lot of campaigns targeted towards our community. However, unfortunately, we rarely ever segment that community. Almost always it is a, like you mentioned, there was 3, we almost always measure in 2. And it's tough to get around it because from what I can see, like I don't do a lot of the direct, I just receive reports from my team. So I don't see exactly what like YouTube allows to track via KPIs, but a lot of it just, our numbers are false because some folks will choose something that they don't truly identify with, or they'll choose nothing because they're like, well, this isn't me. So we get absolutely just poor data. So a lot of it, sadly, a lot of the things that we adjust for KPIs are, lack of a better phrase, a guess. So that's one of the things that I'm dealing with now is how do we target specifically, but even more so, how do we, with the KPI aspect you mentioned, how do we gauge success accurately rather than just saying, you know, probably a percentage of this, we'll probably hit 30%. A lot of it just comes down to just that. So in my experience, we don't really have a good way of doing that. And that does sadden me.
Yeah, well, it's a sad time, Gary. I think another really great note that you bring up there is that there are these sort of guesses that happen out there. And sometimes it's a matter of, oh, as it turns out, I never work out. So Lululemon, you don't need to come at me that strongly. And sometimes it's a matter of being served an ad on, in the case of Selena's previous employer, where you're on a dating app, or maybe LinkedIn, or Indeed, where it's a job-related app, and the stakes are a lot higher, where that intended target audience is important, because if not, you make that person invisible in the experience, like you mentioned. I also am curious from the creator side as well, but I'll give you this as well. A recent GLAAD study found that representation of queer folks in campaigns increased the general population's comfortability among and around members of the queer community. And I'm curious, what are some ways brands can leverage creators authentically? Adante, do you want to take this one as a creator? And as a newcomer of maybe don't spill all your secrets coming into the game, but give us a few.
Yeah, I think just seeing that brands are willing to work with actual queer content creators, I feel like that is a big step. Just going back to the whole working with us and not for us. I think just taking that initial step and seeing that brands actually do want to work with queer creators will kind of give them the incentive, but also at the same time, the motive has to be good too. Obviously, it's not just, oh, I want to work with this popular queer content creator because they have 2 million views or 2 million followers on Instagram. It has to fit back to the bigger picture of how will this actually impact the community, and actually finding ways that will impact the community, whether the end result being a donation of some sort to some type of nonprofit or something that is actually helping people within the community, or just donating to these communities directly. I feel like will give people leverage to actually want to start working with these companies.
I'm so glad you mentioned that the right reasons. I'm sure we can imagine that after this past week, there's, with the combination of Pride and the Supreme Court verdict, there is a fear of a lot of lack of transparency and ways that brands can monopolize on another trauma. So I'm curious to know from all of you how you might have seen creators unfairly monetized by brands, whether it's through the rainbow hysteria, I'll call it, in June, or whether it's just through another inauthentic way that a company has used the trauma of a marginalized group to either give folks with privilege a more powerful experience or elevate their own brand. Selena, do you want to start?
Sorry, I think the last bit cut out a little bit. Could you repeat that?
Sure. So really just looking at what are some ways you've seen creators unfairly monetized by brands. And anyone can start if you want to crowdsource the answer, Selena.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It makes me think about, like, I only attended the LA Pride Parade once, and just seeing like all of the floats by like banks and like just like these giant corporations felt really off to me, because I don't know, it's just, I don't know. I don't think I had like the trust that just because you have like a float, like a giant float in the Pride Parade, that you're actually like helping the community, like in terms of your employees and also just like the community at large. Um, like it feels way more of a like a marketing thing than just like tangible change. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's like the first thing that I think about.
No, that's a really fair point. I think the floats from like Wells Fargo can be a little off-putting. And I think even just you I think that true allyship, as Adante was saying, speaks in terms of money and action. What about you, Carrie? Especially being on the brand side as well, how have you, as even a consumer or as a marketer, seen creators and talent unfairly monetized by brands?
I feel like I see it all the time, but Selena brought up a great point that I was going to mention. She mentioned like the parades and things like that. Like I feel the same way. She described banks, but my issue is also with that, but also seeing like, whatever office is running at the time, like this person who's in the float who wants to be mayor or even down to like comptroller or something like that, who has expressed no interest in supporting the community. It's never had anything to do with it. They don't praise it or say anything, just do nothing in regard to allyship. It's just, hey, I need to be in this flow so they could see me, and I'll throw out some beads and things like that. So that really bothers me, but I see it all the time. But also just when it comes to other ways of not really, this is probably a smaller issue, but just when they exploit like you look at Instagram and there'll be a really popular influencer who's part of the community. And instead of working directly with them, a lot of times brands will see, oh, this person has really high engagement. So I'm just going to go into the comments section and say some quirky, funny thing and just get like, free engagement off of that because people will comment on it or go to that other page. And that the person whose page whose account they just posted it on gets no recognition. They're not tagged. They're not paid for it. It's just, and I see that constantly. And it really also gets to me a little bit too, because it's just part of exploiting the community without actually being involved. You just see a person with a high number. It's like, hey, we want to target the gay community. I'm just going to post in here.
Oh yeah.
But like on a personal level, I think I really wish I could see, I don't know if this necessarily answers your question, but I wish I could see more people in my community, gay or bi or Black, whatever, get into like working on the account side. I think we have a lot of folks that are part of the community who are just now getting recognized and brought into the advertising community, but still not leading it. And I know creatives, there are creative leaders and things like that, but the ones who really drive forward the business and like they bring in the new business and they bring in the client interactions, things like that. I wish I saw more of us there. And even now, I'm not sure why we don't. I don't know if it's a fear or is it because, am I in it because, again, like I mentioned before, I don't project. So am I just in it because I've sort of snuck around? So, those are just kind of my thoughts there.
Yeah, no, that's real talk. And I think that even having more queer representation on that account side would really speak volume, even as some of the research had indicated that the more exposure to queer people allows people to be more comfortable. And then that, of course, informs a lot of the decisions that are made around the queer experience, not just in product, but in government. That's truly a valuable insight, Carrie. Thank you. So I would love to move on to questions. I know we just have 10 minutes left, so I think we already did chat about our last question, which was just, what are some of the highlights of this month's Pride campaigns? I know it's very hard to think about highlights, but who's doing it right this year? If before we jump into questions, if any of you want to route our attention to a brand or even a creator who's doing things right, authentically and unapologetically this year, please throw it in the chat, let us know, or speak aloud.
No, playing into both what we were just talking about, I do think it's interesting, coming from the Black community, how I don't know if y'all know about like what's going on with like Lil Nas X, and he just dropped his single FBET because the BET Awards has been giving him no love, and he's been on like the top of the charts for like the past year or two. And he's even I was even reading about when they offered him to do his BET performance, I think last year, and they were talking to his PR team and stuff, or whoever they talked to, and they were like, yeah, so before we give you guys the okay to perform, we need to know like what is going to be in this performance. Is Lil Nas X a Satanist? Like, what is he going to be doing on stage? And he basically had to give this big list of what he's not going to be doing, just in order to be able to have that performance that he had. And yeah, now they're not nominating him for BET Awards and stuff, and he's obviously a big influence to the queer and the Black community right now. So it's just interesting seeing that happen.
Dante's talking about just dragging who's doing it wrong right now. I love it. Who's doing it right? Who's doing it wrong? Yeah. And I think that's a really great point is, you know, the intersectionality as well in a lot of our workspaces is, you know, I remember being at one job when DMX died, and I was part of the LGBTQ ERG as well as the Black ERG. The Black ERG was mourning DMX, and we wanted to play them at an all hands. And of course, I and a couple of others, you know, were like, well, maybe we don't need to go tribute to DMX because he's kind of a homophobe. Maybe we just let this one rock without us. And we wanted to be really respectful, but it was really hard to align there when not everybody had exactly what we were talking about, that exposure to the community, that comfortability, and that ability to be like, hey, like put yourself in our position of having to fight for visibility like every group of marginalized people have. Anyway, Adante, that was a really great example. I'd love to hear Carrie and Selena before we move on to other questions. Do you have another example, good or bad, to add?
I honestly don't think I can add a positive one, only because if there's a positive one right now, I haven't seen it because it just gets drowned out by like the standard generic rainbow month. So yeah, nothing I could think of.
Carrie, lovely. Love the honesty. Go ahead, Selena.
I don't know exactly how relevant this is, but I think one person that I think has been doing a good job, she's an athlete, she's a pro surfer, and historically the surfing community has not really been very good about accepting the queer people in the surf community, and she is she's very outspoken about her queerness and her queer relationship, and she shows it on her social media, where she has a pretty large following because she's a very prominent athlete. I think she shows it in a way that like feels very natural and not pandering, but it's just like, it just seems like she's very proud of who she is, and it like feels like a really nice like step in the correct direction for the surf community. And it's also really nice to see that like she has been pretty supported in her outspokenness, and I feel like that's like just exactly what I want to see from like people who have that sort of influence and are able to talk about it. Oh, sorry, I don't think I mentioned her name. Her name is Tyler Wright. I will post it in the chat as well. Kristen, I think you might be muted.
Oh man, I was saying some really wise stuff, I promise. But now we're gonna go to questions. It's over. The wise moment is over. Carlos, I know you've been keeping track, but I am assuming we don't have any as of yet. I haven't seen any come through, so I'll let the audience put any in the chat now for our panelists.
Kristen, can I add a point or just like an observation about just kind of brands doing it or just how they're doing it this year that's a little different?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to hear from anyone within the queer community, especially who is talking about things doing how brands can do it right. I think this is absolutely the space for that. Please go ahead.
Well, I also want to leave the space for anybody in the queer community because I don't identify as such, but I want to make sure that I pause in case anybody else wants to speak first.
Oh, yeah, that would be awesome. How about we do that and then we'll come back to questions afterwards. Everyone, let me just check the chat. What would you like to see from companies when building more inclusive work environments? That's a really great one. Carrie, do you want to chime in there on inclusive work environments? You mentioned your team, so it sounds like you might have a little bit of experience there. So why don't you kick us off?
Sure. I think I probably talked about this a little bit. Is one, I'd like to see more of my community in the account side or the new business side or the strategy side. So I think a lot of times it lands on like this very small group of folks. I think in the grand scheme of the company, the organization I'm with, there are only two of us. So it's hard to have a voice as large as the straight community, where they're like, here's how we market to those folks. And a lot of times, like I mentioned before, it's sometimes it's over the top. It's a little too cringe because they don't know they see what other companies are doing, and they merely just emulate. So I'd like to see more of folks from the queer community in those aspects that drive the business. But I'd also like to see, there'd be just even if it's something as small as just like a Teams group where it's just, people who are part of not necessarily allyship, but people who are actually part of the community, where we can talk to each other and just communicate freely and discuss issues that we've got, or whether they're general issues or something specific that they're dealing with their management or their staff or their client. We can just kind of work ideas off of each other. I think that's one of the ways that I'd like to see in my organization, because I think that will help us all become more comfortable in dealing with that or working with it and being able to work with our internal teams as well as work with the brands and how to pitch.
Absolutely. That's really valid. Very strong points, Carrie. Do you have anything to actually, it would be really great to hear from you, Adante, to hear the flip side of that, or what are some of your expectations from brands in terms of them building creative, inclusive, diverse teams? Is that on the top of a creator like yourselves list? In terms of who you're going to be collaborating with, or in terms of what employment you might join?
Yeah, so, and I feel like I might get a little blindsided going into the workforce because I was lucky enough to go to a university where, I don't know if it's just the film department of my university, but all of my professors were very inclusive. They were very do whatever you want to do, like do whatever, put whatever you want in your films, be however expressive you want. Like that's what we're here for, kind of thing. So I feel like going into an environment that's not as inclusive would definitely be scary, but it's definitely something that's on the top of my list. And I feel like as a filmmaker, one of the luxuries that I do have is being able to choose the projects that I want to work for, and obviously only working for projects that have an end message that actually resonate with something that I believe in. I'm not going to work on a film that's promoting Donald Trump, like, you know what I mean? So I just feel like yeah, as a content creator, I kind of have that freedom to kind of only put myself in situations that I want to be in terms of the content I'm creating. You're muted, I think.
Amazing. I was saying that that's the dream. And yeah, and that's really amazing. I think that whenever a creator can have the luxury to do that, that's really important. Anything to add, Selena, or any other questions? I know I want to get back to Pam as well, since we're at 6 o'clock and you had feedback, or what's up, Pam? I want to circle back to you.
No, it's just an observation when you were talking about brands that are doing it right, or dragging brands that are doing it wrong. But just an observation about kind of this year and this month, but also not that important to drop it in for time. So I'm happy to move on if we don't have time for it.
Oh no, please go for it.
I think the thing that's been interesting is every year I note for cultural months kind of what brands are doing. And what's been interesting this year with Pride is you still get kind of the cookie cutter, rainbow flags that are being displayed everywhere. But what I think it was at Converse, and I noticed a few other stores that didn't do as visible of like just, full blown rainbow colors everywhere, that they actually muted the colors a little bit, or maybe not muted isn't the right word. They just didn't actually have that front and center. And instead it was a lot more, there's more depth. There was a little bit more sophistication in terms of the stories that they were choosing to tell. And granted, they're still using they're highlighting certain stories for 1 month because it is the kind of cultural / identity month. But I saw quite a few brands actually kind of take a step back from just rainbow usage and trying to find more integrated and detailed ways to share LGBTQIA and queer stories. That at least is a step in the right direction, I think, in terms of depth and sophistication. I think my only concern, having sat on both the brand side and the agency side, the only concern is that really lives and dies with who sits in those seats, right? Going back to Carrie's point about who's sitting in what seats to kind of make these decisions. And so as I was noting that for this year, it's kind of like, I wonder if what next year will be like if, let's say, the brand manager changes or let's say the agency changes. So that was the only thing I was going to note. The only brand I remember very distinctly was Converse. And they had a campaign, I think, about family and what Chosen Family was about. And all the content they had in store was centered around that theme and lots of visuals of people and their stories. And way less on the rainbows. But I noted that from a few other brands. I just can't remember offhand who they were.
Cool. Yeah, Converse is an interesting brand. Being it's also in streetwear, I feel like it's kind of gets lumped in with like really progressive folks and then like hate groups. So I love that they have a muted anything is a good idea. Yeah, I feel like that's really an interesting observation too, Pam. I'm really glad that you brought it up for us because I think it is important to acknowledge when there is a shift because, I feel like we have been asking for brands to tone it down and be more genuine and authentic as a community every June. So, you know, it's great to know that, you know, there's some acknowledgement, and I wish we had time to hear a little bit more on that from our panelists in the community who could kind of speak to maybe if they've seen some of those brands doing it right. Do y'all have a couple minutes maybe to just reflect on Pam's question? And I know, Carrie, you said you didn't see any brands doing anything right. So maybe you can start us off.
It's not that I didn't see any brands doing it right. I just haven't really been, even though I work in advertising, I really have not been watching a lot of the ad space right now. I don't really have any, I don't have a response. I need to noodle on this for just a bit, I think.
Yeah, I think I need to do the same. How about you, Selena and Adante?
I can't think of anything off of the top of my head, but like Pam was saying, I do think that if more brands actually sit back and take the time to connect with the community, choose to tell stories rather than just implement a rainbow of some sort or something, but actually educate and tell stories that resonate with the community, I feel like those are great beginning steps to actually going in the right direction.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm curious for all of you guys on another note for us to all reflect on, you know, is that what we want as queer folks in the community? You know, I think we see that a lot of bad feedback and I certainly have when I've done campaigns for whether it's for the queer community or the Black community. And I often have wondered, is it a brand's place to tell my story? So something to think about. I think that's where we're all at too. Nice place to end on. Kenny, why don't you bring us home with where we're at? And yeah, I agree. Target does kind of win me over sometimes too. I see that in the chat. Kenny, please take us home. Appreciate everybody and thank you for coming.
Yeah, so thank sorry. Something my screen is going on. So thank you everyone for pulling up tonight. We truly appreciate y'all. Shout out to Kristen and the entire Roses Pride team for another great one. It's always great to be able to be in the garden with all of you and really be able to learn for those of us that are not in the community, but just sit back and just take some time to listen and learn, and also leverage the information and take it back to wherever we work. So we will be looking into making some donations to some organizations that the team has provided, and we will also be making another donation to Planned Parenthood in light of the bullshit that's going on, to be frank. So once again, everyone, have a great evening, and thank you for spending a little time with the Roses. We're probably going to be a little bit quiet between now and September because we're going to just be getting stuff together for the fall, but the growth initiative is going strong right now. So thank you to the growth team that I see on the call, and some of the gifts that are even on the call, some of our alumni that are on the call. And yeah, everybody have a great night. Stay safe. Take care of one another. Peace out.